In the winter of 1940, a man named Ivan Kovalev was transferred from a transit prison in Vladivostok to a logging camp in the Kolyma region of northeastern Siberia. The journey took 3 weeks in an unheated freight car with 80 other men. When he arrived, the temperature was negative 47 degrees Celsius. His official daily food ration was 800 grams of bread. He received 400. The camp administrator had been skimming the difference for 6 months. Nobody investigated. Nobody was surprised. Kovalev was one of approximately 1.8 million people inside the Soviet Gulag system in 1940, a network of 476 distinct camp complexes spread across the largest country on Earth. You would not have survived any of this. And over the next several minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why. Let me start with where you are, because the geography of the Gulag was not accidental. The camps were placed in the most hostile environments the Soviet Union could find, and the Soviet Union contained some of the most hostile environments on the planet. Kolyma alone, a region in the far northeast, roughly the size of Western Europe, held somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 prisoners across its peak years, working gold and tin mines in a territory where the average January temperature sits around negative 50 Celsius and the ground never fully thaws. Anne Applebaum, whose 2003 history of the Gulag system remains the definitive English language account, describes Kolyma as a place where the permafrost goes down 1,400 meters and the summer lasts approximately 6 weeks. The Soviets called it the land of white death. They were not being poetic, but Kolyma was only one node. The Gulag stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, from the Arctic Circle to the deserts of Kazakhstan. You might have ended up in the timber camps of Karelia, the coal mines of Vorkuta north of the Arctic Circle, the copper operations at Norilsk, where temperatures regularly hit negative 55, or the canal construction sites where prisoners dug by hand because machinery was considered too expensive to waste on people who could be replaced. The White Sea Canal, completed in 1933, was built by 100,000 prisoners using hand tools, wheelbarrows, and wooden cranes. Approximately 25,000 of them died during construction. Soviet propaganda celebrated the project as a triumph of socialist labor. The canal turned out to be too shallow for most of the ships it was supposed to carry. That tells you nearly everything you need to know about how the Gulag understood human life. Now let me take you inside the barracks, because the barracks is where you will spend every hour you are not working, and I use the word shelter loosely. A standard Gulag barracks in 1940 was a wooden structure designed to hold roughly 100 people, and typically holding 150 to 200. The bunks were 2 or 3 tiers of bare wooden planks, sometimes with a thin layer of straw, more often without. Prisoners slept in their work clothes because there were no blankets sufficient for the temperatures, and because anything left unattended would be stolen before morning. The stove, if the barracks had one, burned for a few hours in the evening. By midnight, the interior temperature in a Kolyma barracks in January could drop to negative 20 Celsius. Prisoners reported waking with their hair frozen to the wooden bunk above them. The lice were so pervasive that prisoners stopped treating them as a problem and started treating them as a condition of existence, which is the kind of cognitive adjustment you make when the alternative is despair. Here is the thing about the food that most people get completely wrong. The popular image of Gulag prisoners as simply starved is accurate but incomplete in a way that matters. The Soviet system did not simply withhold food, it weaponized food with bureaucratic precision. Rations were calibrated to work output through a system called the norm. Each prisoner was assigned a daily production quota. Cubic meters of timber felled, tons of earth moved, meters of coal extracted. If you met your norm, you received the full ration, somewhere between 800 and 900 grams of bread, plus a ladle of thin soup called balanda, which was primarily hot water with occasional cabbage. If you fell short of your norm, your ration was cut proportionally. If you fell significantly short, you received the punishment ration, 400 grams of bread and nothing else. The problem, which the system's designers either did not notice or did not care about, was that a malnourished person cannot meet a production norm designed for a healthy person, which means their ration gets cut, which means they become more malnourished, which means they fall further behind their norm, which means the ration gets cut again. Prisoners called this the spiral. The medical term is cachexia. The practical outcome was that a prisoner who entered the spiral in October was typically dead by February. The work itself was calibrated to the same logic of expendability. Logging brigades in Kolyma worked 10 to 12-hour shifts in temperatures that could kill an exposed person in under an hour. The standard equipment was an axe, a two-person saw, and whatever clothing the prisoner had arrived with, supplemented by whatever the camp administration chose to provide, which was rarely sufficient and frequently stolen by the time it reached the prisoner. Frostbite was so common that the camp medical system had developed a formal triage protocol, distinguishing between frostbite cases worth treating and frostbite cases not worth the medical supplies. Prisoners with blackened fingers were sometimes sent back to work because the alternative was admitting they could no longer meet their norm, which would trigger the ration spiral. Some chose to continue working on hands they could no longer feel. The ones who survived this decision lost the fingers anyway, later in the infirmary, when the tissue finally died. And we have not even gotten to what happened if you broke the rules. And that is worth staying for. Gulag discipline operated through a system of punishments that escalated from reduced rations through solitary confinement to transfer to a penalty camp, which was a camp within the camp system designed specifically to extract maximum labor from prisoners considered problematic before they died. The penalty isolator, called the ShIZO, was a cell with no heat, no bunk, and a ration of 300 grams of bread every other day. Prisoners sent to the ShIZO in winter for 10 days frequently did not return. This was understood by all parties. The camp guards who administered the ShIZO were not sadists operating outside the system. They were functionaries operating precisely within it. The paperwork was filed correctly. The regulations were followed. The Gulag's greatest horror is not that it was chaotic. It is that it was orderly. The criminal prisoner population added a dimension of danger that the official system did not need to manufacture. The Gulag held two broad populations. The politicals, arrested under Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code for offenses, including counter-revolutionary activity, anti-Soviet agitation, and association with enemies of the people, and the common criminals, called Urki, who had their own hierarchy, their own code, and their own relationship to the camp administration that was frequently cooperative. The Urki ran the barracks. They controlled the distribution of food within the prisoner population, the allocation of sleeping positions, and the informal economy of theft and violence that operated alongside the official camp economy. A political prisoner arriving at a new camp in 1940 with a warm coat, decent boots, or any possession of value would typically lose those possessions within 72 hours. The camp administration was aware of this. In many camps, it was considered useful. A prisoner stripped of their coat in January is a prisoner too focused on survival to organize. You would have woken before dawn to a guard's whistle in a barracks that smelled of 200 unwashed bodies, wet wood, and the latrine bucket in the corner that was emptied once a day. You would have stood in formation in the dark while a guard counted you, then counted you again, because the penalty for a miscount fell on the guards, and they were not taking chances. You would have marched to the worksite in column, with dogs on either side, And you would have worked until the light failed, and then worked a little longer, because the norm did not care about the light. You would have eaten your balanda standing up because there were not enough seats. You would have slept in your clothes with one hand on your boots, because boots left unattended were gone by morning, and a man without boots in Kolyma in January was a man who would not see February. You would have done all of this while weighing, if you arrived healthy, somewhere around 60% of your entry body weight, because that is what 4 months in the Gulag did to a healthy adult male. The only difference between you and the 1.8 million people who lived this in 1940 is that you had the luck of being born into a different century. They did not get to choose